All right, welcome everyone to Talking Literature with Sturgis Library. We're so excited to have many great authors here tonight. We've got Leni Zumas, we've got Mona Awad, we've got Jake Wolff, and Asia Gabel, all of whom we're super excited to have here because they're authors we commonly recommend at Sturgis and they're books that have been widely read in our system, so that's great. We're going to talk a little bit about the art of writing. We're going to talk a little bit about reading recommendations, the literary field today. And we're really excited to have you all here. So just thank you so much for spending your night with us, because you could literally be doing anything else because we have the internet now. You could watch any concert, you could be watching any other reader, but you're hanging out with us and that's special to us. So thank you so much for joining us. Before we jump into the questions tonight, we're gonna do a little intro. Also a heads up, everyone is muted. We just do that as a way to make sure that there's no Zoom bombers. But there's gonna be a Q&A at the end tonight. So once we get there, just either add your questions to the chat and I'll be the moderator for that, and that'll be great. You can either send your questions at the end or send them as you get them and I'll just kind of compile them as I go, whatever makes you happy. But yeah, again, thank you so much for being here with us at Sturgis, and we hope you enjoy the talk tonight. So let's do a little bit of a bio go through. So first we've got Leni Zumas. Leni Zumas' best-selling novel, Red Clocks, won the 2019 Oregon Book Award for fiction and was shortlisted for the Orwell Prize for political fiction and the Newcomb Award for speculative fiction. Vulture called it one of the 100 most important books of the 21st century so far. Red Clocks has been translated into 8 languages also. Zumas is also the author of Farewell Navigator Stories, which came out in 2008, and the novel The Listeners in 2012. Her stories, essays, and interviews have appeared in Granta, The Times Literary Supplement, Guernica, Bomb, The Cut, Portland Monthly, Tin House, and elsewhere. Zumas lives in Oregon and teaches in the creative writing program at Portland State University. Next, we got Mona Awad. Mona Awad is the author of Bunny, named a best book of 2019 by Time, Vogue, and the New York Public Library. Awad's first novel, 13 Ways of Looking at a Fat Girl, was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and winner of the Colorado Book Award and the Amazon Canada First Novel Award. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Vogue, Time, McSweeney's Plowshares, and elsewhere. She teaches fiction in the creative writing program at Syracuse University. Her new novel, which is excellent, All's Well, has been named a best or most anticipated book of summer by Entertainment Weekly, O Magazine, Goodreads, and many more. Next, we've got Jake Wolff. Jake Wolff is the author of the novel The History of Living Forever from Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. I always stumble on that one. His stories and essays have appeared in journals such as One Story, Tin House, and American Short Fiction. He lives in Orlando, Florida, where he teaches in the MFA program at the University of Central Florida and serves as the editor of the Florida Review. And finally, we have Asia Gabel. Asia's prose can be found in The Cut, BuzzFeed, Kenyon Review, Bomb, and elsewhere. She studied writing at Wesleyan University and the University of Virginia and has a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston. Her debut novel, The Ensemble, is out now from Riverhead and is very much loved at Sturgis Library. And she lives and writes in Los Angeles. So that's the big welcoming round for everyone. And we're going to jump in with our first question, which we always like to start these talks with because we've done a couple of them. So if you were to give like an elevator pitch for either the book you're working on now or the last thing you published, what would that elevator pitch be? And let's start with Asia.
Oh gosh, I was hoping you weren't going to start. I was actually just working on it moments before I signed on to this, and it's a novel that I'm currently rewriting that is very different from The Ensemble, and it's a sort of a time travel story, a time travel romance that takes place in 2 places I am sort of just wanted to write about, which are Marfa and Japan, and I really wanted to write about motherhood and fatherhood and science and art. And so that's kind of what it's about. We'll see if it comes together.
Oh, I can go next. Sorry, I forgot we're supposed to just jump in now. So my Again, my novel is called The History of Living Forever. It's the kind of the quick pitch is it's about a 16-year-old sort of science prodigy who tries to find a cure for his father's fatal illness. And that kind of leads him on this big kind of epic centuries and continent spanning quest in a world of fringe medicine and history. And I also, if you don't mind, want to make a quick plug for the journal I edit, which is the Florida Review. We have a print journal that you can subscribe to and an online journal that's totally free. And we publish fiction and poetry and nonfiction, graphic narrative, art, film, basically everything. So if you're here and you're a writer looking to submit somewhere, please consider us. And if you're here because you're a reader and you like short work, please check out the Florida Review.
It's a beautiful journal, I will add. I always love looking at it.
Oh, thank you so much.
I'm Leni, and my current novel is such a mess that I don't even want to say anything about it. But my most recent book, Red Clocks, is about an America, 4 women living in an America where abortion is criminalized because Roe v. Wade has been struck down.
I have been talking about All's Well for a while now, so I think I'll just talk about the thing I'm working on. Mine is I'm kind of in the middle of revising it right now, but it's about a woman who gets sucked into this really sinister beauty cult, and there are red jellyfish, and it's kind of like Sephora horror meets Snow White.
That's exciting.
I always get so excited when I hear whatever your new project is, because it's always like a very interesting view of horror blend with a bunch of other stuff that I never thought was going to end up together, like All's Well, like Shakespearean horror. Like, oh, it's so good. If All's Well yet, people out there, like, definitely check it out. We're going to jump to the next question. We're going to start with Leni on this one. So for all the writers out there, everyone in the audience who's trying to put pen to paper and all that stuff, what do you believe is the most important craft advice you could give someone who's just starting out, or who's someone who's like new to writing fiction? Take it away.
I've been talking to my grad students a lot about this question, what it even is craft. And I recently heard a great interview with Percival Everett, who is also a teacher, and he said he thinks his job when he goes into the classroom is to disabuse his students of the notion that there is one right way to do it. And I really like that definition of approaching craft, because I think for me, like the writing advice I would give people is read more, and like sometimes I just want to tell my students, like, it's okay, just read some books, and then and it's not that simple, but rather than memorizing like rules, if you immerse yourself as much as you can in a really wide array of not just fiction, but nonfiction, poetry, essays, botany, catalogs. I think that's the way through craft.
Yeah, I would agree. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I would agree. I'd just say be curious. I think it's all about, being curious and following your curiosity. And I would say it's kind of along these lines, but just write, I think, what excites you rather than what maybe you think that you should be writing. I think you kind of toggle between those two when you're first starting. Like, what should my first thing be versus what kind of really lights me up inside? And I think following that impulse is really important, and making space for it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, which is what I wish somebody told me, which is basically just to write, like, don't be embarrassed by your obsessions, and to write about your obsessions. I think that's like the thing that's always fueled me, because writing a novel especially is a really long, hard endeavor. It's going to take a long time, and you have to be really interested and love what you're the subject. And so if you're going to live there for a while, and so like Mona said, I think early on I thought that I should be writing like writers that I admired, like Mary Gateskill or you know, Zadie Smith or something, but I'm not them, and I should have just started earlier writing what I love. And people respond to that too. Like you can tell when you publish something that you're really like kind of nervous to share because it's so close to you, that people respond to that because they recognize that it's vital.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly there's no problem in my writing that I've ever encountered that couldn't be solved through reading. So I do think that's kind of like probably the correct answer to the question, is just to read widely. I mean, just to add something else, I guess I'd say, you know, speaking as an editor, the single most common reason that I reject a story that's been sent to me is because it doesn't establish its conflicts quickly enough. So I think finding the conflicts that interest you and are meaningful to you is one of the keys to writing. So I'd say kind of like as you're reading widely and as you're writing things that interest you, pay attention maybe specifically to the ways that, you know, great writers like Asia and Mona and Leni, that they approach establishing conflicts really quickly.
And the cool thing is, like, also going off Asia's point about obsession and conflict can be so many things. It can be in the sentence, it can be the language kind of at war with itself, you know, that and also if that's what excites you, like I just love what all three of you said. And I think for students, not, or for any writer, not students, but not to have like this idea that, and we'll talk about this later when I'm sure we'll talk about social media today, because, but rather than think like, how will this be received? Like how, like, you know, what meme could come from this book? Like, if you can shut that part of your brain off for as long as possible, do that.
And I appreciate that right now, because I feel like I am very much on social media a lot, and I would like to not be on social media as much. So
It's hard.
yeah. Oh, it's so hard, especially when you have something coming out. Like recently, you're like, if I have a story coming out, I like need to be on social media or no one's going to see it. So fun times for all. Let's start. Jake, if you want to start this one, that'd be awesome. So what sort of changes have you seen in the literary field over the past 10 years, and where do you see it going in the future? This can be like genre stuff and anything.
Yeah, honestly, it's a big question. I mean, certainly so much of my kind of experience of trends come through what my students are writing. And certainly in the past 10 years, the kind of the big boom and then continued rise of YA as a genre has been something that I felt really deeply. You know, a huge amount of my students, even graduate students in their, you know, mid to late 20s in many cases, I'm pretty much exclusively read and write YA. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that. And I don't see that, I don't see that stopping anytime soon. I think that trend is going to continue to grow in a pretty powerful way. You know, on the logistical side of things, you know, I think maybe the darker side of things, I think, you know, the supply chain issues are also not going to go away. And I do worry that we're heading into a kind of a period where increasingly publishing is getting more and more narrow, you know, with a few publishing houses kind of like directing the whole world of publishing. You know, I think what we're seeing is that kind of overall books are selling well still, but it's an increasingly small number of books that are selling a lot rather than a wide range of books selling somewhat more equally. So that's a kind of a concern I have for the future is it going to get harder and harder for writers on the margins, writers with smaller presses to get their names out there, which is why, you know, libraries and librarians are so important in terms of getting the actual right book into someone's hands, rather than just whatever book, you know, an Amazon algorithm thinks is the next book that they should read.
I too have a lot of students writing YA, and I think one kind of trend that like I think is really good news is people are talking more, or at least the writers that I talk to, about kind of blurring the genre lines, and there's a more porous membrane between you know, horror and literary fiction you know, like, you know, Mona, we were talking about your books, and I think anytime that we question the sort of marketing categories that are used to label our work, and really focus on what a book is doing on its own, and not just because of where it's going to go, and like, you know, Barnes and Noble. I'm really glad that conversation is happening. Yeah.
I was going to say that I think in as recently as like, you know, 8 years ago, I feel like there was still this idea that you could only have kind of like one diverse writer on the roster, and they wrote about the immigrant experience or something. And I think that that's rapidly changed in the last few years, you know, for whatever reasons, nefarious or like, you know, capitalist or otherwise. And I think it's really cool. And I think you can find, you know, a ton of Nigerian writers. You can read pop fiction about racism, like a light book about racism. You can read, Jasmine Guillory's like romances. So I think that's really, really cool. And I really hope that that continues. Like, I hope that writers of non-white writers can write about, don't have to write about race necessarily. And I think that that's a hopeful trend that I'm seeing.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's something that I'm excited about too. I think there's more room now for diversity, and diversity means something else. It's a much more open idea of what that encompasses. And just going back to Leni's point about genre, that's something that really excites me too, because I really hate that box that literary fiction kind of gets put in, and then fairy tale has to be over here, and horror and sci-fi and dystopia, when really literary fiction kind of, I think, allows for all of those things to play together if they want to, you know. And I'm seeing more and more books do that, and those books really excite me. So that's something that I hope will continue, that we kind of are more open to different kinds of storytelling traditions. Yeah.
And that's the best answer possible, because that's one of the things I'm always trying to push at the library, is trying to get people who are like, because you'll have different patrons who will come in, and I'll be like, oh, you might like this sci-fi book, or you might like this horror book, and they'll be like, whoa, I do not dabble in the sci-fi or the horror. And that makes me really sad, you know, because it limits you. And there's so much good fiction being published in all the different genres that are blending everything together. I mean, you look at, this is kind of a weird move for that, but like, you look at Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell from like, what was that, 15 years ago or something? And that blends like all the stuff together, and everyone's like, this is a work of literary fiction.
Yeah.
Most books don't get that, which is very sad, because like, I don't know, labels are evil sometimes, but also help they also help patrons find what they're really into. So it's like, it's a weird like back and forth, you know, where it's someone who really loves sci-fi, if you can direct them to new sci-fi, they get super excited. But yeah, so I'm with everyone there. Mona, if you want to start this next one, it's, which books are you excited for that have either been released recently or are forthcoming? And which up-and-coming writers do you think people should have on their radar?
Well, I'm obsessed. I have to bring it up, even though it came out a year ago. Kira Nessie by Susanna Clark is just such a brilliant book. I just love her use of voice, and it's just so arresting and strange. I adored it. And then I taught a horror class this fall, and and we read Lakewood by Megan Giddings. That book came out with Amistad also in 2020, I'm realizing, sorry. But it's a really, really interesting literary fiction as well. And that sort of plays with our anxieties about scientific experimentation and race. And it's so powerful and beautiful. So I highly recommend Megan Giddings. She has another book coming out soon, I think next year. And there was somebody else. Oh, yes. Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin is just brilliant. Again, very kind of I think it blends a lot of different genres together too. It's like, it's very surreal. There's kind of an element of dystopia there, and definitely horror. But it's just, it's so propulsive, and there's so much tension. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Mona, have you watched the adaptation of that book yet?
You know, I saw just the first 5 minutes, and I was like, oh, okay, I gotta watch this. But I'm a little afraid because I love the book so much. And when I love the book so much, I get scared to watch the adaptation.
Me too. Yeah. I haven't watched it yet either, because that book was so terrifying when I read it, and I kind of want to preserve that feeling. I'm dying, like I can feel myself dying to read the new Hanya Yanagihara book, which I can't remember the name of, To Paradise, I think that's coming out. But she did what's the name? A Little Life. And I just can't wait to read the epic that it will become. So I'm so excited to read that. I think it's also pretty genre bendy it sounds like from what I've read. I think something takes place in the very, very far future, ancient times. And then a book that's coming out in January is a book of short stories called Fiona and Jane by a writer named Jean Chen Ho. And it's about two Chinese American girlfriends growing up in Southern California. And it's kind of like their whole coming of age, and it's really beautiful.
Yeah, that book sounds so good. Yeah, I'll plug a few Florida writers. Definitely one of the best collections that I read this year was Dante Moni's Milk, Blood, Heat. It's just, I think, a perfect collection.
That's a great book.
Yeah, I mean, just like an extremely wide variety of stories that play with all different kinds of genres and tones, but also feels really cohesive and powerful. Another collection that I loved is from a former colleague of mine named Brenda Peinado. It's called The Rock Eaters. If anyone here, if you like magical realism and you haven't read The Rock Eaters, you should correct that immediately. I can't imagine a kind of better collection of magical realist stories than The Rock Eaters. Thinking about kind of up and coming, thinking Florida still, we published a really awesome up and coming writer named Monica Bashirs, who has
she's a student of ours. Yeah,
she's incredible. Can I actually type into the chat?
Yeah.
Is that allowed?
Oh yeah, go to town.
Monica Bashirs, and the story that she published with us was called What the Dolls See. So if you Google that, you'll find it. And she has a novel coming out in, I think it's probably 2023, called House of Cotton. That just sounds like utterly unbelievable. I just think she's one of those kind of shooting to the stars kind of writers, a name you'll know, and I love publishing her story.
I also want to put one of my current colleagues' books on the radar, not because she's my colleague, but she's an amazing writer. Janice Lee, her latest novel is called Imagine a Death, and it is a kind of beautiful and really wrenching and unflinching meditation on death and the apocalypse and grief, and I know it sounds like kind of a downer, but like it's actually so it's unlike anything I've read before, and because it's on a very small or a smaller press, a university press, you know, it hasn't been getting reviews, and this book, she's so brilliant, and I just it reminds me of why it's so frustrating what Jake was talking about earlier with the kind of like consolidation of these big four now publishers. It's like so much great art just doesn't get read because people aren't finding it. And another book like that just came out is called My Dead Book by Nate Lippens, which is a guy thinking about a lot of, you know, people he knows who died during the AIDS epidemic and his own past as like a teenage prostitute, and his present as like a 50-year-old guy living, you know, in Wisconsin. And that's on a press called Publication Studio. But I hope you can get it for both of those for the library, Corey. They're both great.
I would love to. Also, if you see me looking over there, there's something really strange making noise like in the wall. So I apologize. It's distracting at all because it's distracting me and scary. There is like literally, I don't know if I said in the beginning, if people who have showed up to this have heard it, but like Sturgis, the library itself is like fairly haunted. And literally the other day, I was like reshelving stuff in the Cape Cod section, which is like right over there. There was something like knocking in the wall. And I was like, oh, that's not good. So I went outside to be like, is it a woodpecker? It was not a woodpecker. So who knows? Fun times working in the haunted library. Also, I just wanted to add one recommendation to that because I am a librarian and that's what I always have to do because I've got this urge. But we've been talking about like blending genres and the idea of like horror being mixed with literary, being mixed with like sci-fi and all that kind of stuff. Her name's Kay Chronister and she's got a collection called Thin Places and it came out last year. And every story is just, I think she calls herself like a dark speculative writer or maybe like a dark fabulist or something. But like the language is so insanely beautiful and the stories are just like so out there. It is wonderful. So check that out maybe. Asia, if you want to do the next one, that would be cool. It is yeah, so this was a cool question. So are there any literary tropes or specific narratives you believe might be overdone and deserve some spicing up? Or are there any tropes you've been excited to see get more attention in the recent years?
I mean, I think what we've been talking about, the science fiction literary genre bending dystopian thing is something I'm really into. And I think these other three writers on this panel are experts at and do so well. And something that I been trying to figure out how to sort of articulate this, but I think there's a resurgence, or not resurgence, but like a popularity in novels that are described as voicey that actually have like a very flat affect that is like actually an absence of voice. And I'm not sure why that's so appealing. Like I think there's like very few instances in which it's done well. And if you think about something like Sally Rooney, where it's like really stripped down, and I don't know that if every single book of hers is like incredibly successful in that way, but there's like a purpose and mission behind the sort of the vacancy sometimes. Other times I read it and it makes me feel like more empty, and I kind of hate that feeling, and so and it doesn't lead me to like question it at all. And so I'm curious about like why that is and where that can go. And that's just something I've been thinking about lately. It's also not a way that I write, and so I think I feel insecure about it.
Another trend that I would like to see, or not even a trend, a trope that kind of is in all genres, not just literary fiction, that I hope changes faster than it is changing, is the representation of disabled characters in fiction. The sort of tendency, if someone who's disabled is in a book at all, is their disability is the kind of defining thing about their life, and often their presence is used to help a non-disabled character come to some kind of realization or like make a spiritual like journey, and which is bullshit, and excuse me. But there are starting to be more writers, especially younger writers, who are writing about disability. They're disabled writers themselves, and I think that's really, really exciting. And I hope that signals a change that comes soon.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like, I don't know what I think is overdone. I guess one thing that I'm looking for, I think it does tie into what's been said so far. I've been really interested in trying to publish fiction and nonfiction that is literary and for adults, but also makes room for joy and happiness. I think sometimes kind of like what we think of as literary fiction gets kind of equated with a sort of like a miserablism. and those kinds of books can be beautiful. I mean, sometimes life is miserable, so fiction can be too. But trying to find room for, stories in which, even though the world is hard and filled with inequities, people are still finding ways to find pleasure and joy in it. I think it ties into sort of what you were saying, Asia, about like, it used to be like if there was, say, a queer writer or a Black writer, then their book had to be about like suffering like really deep queer pain and homophobia and violence. And I'm interested in stories in which that confront the realities of those things, but where there's also kind of like joy and happiness coming out of it. Sorry, I'm so shameless. I'm going to put another story that I want people to read by an awesome writer named Ruth Joffre. Story is called Fugues. It's a story about a woman who's kind of coming out as queer late in her life. And I feel like it does exactly what I'm looking for, which is acknowledging the challenges of doing that in a world that can be really hostile to queerness, but also making room for love and romance in like a really interesting, powerful character. So that's just kind of a trend that I'm trying to find both as a reader and as someone who's publishing work.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, this is kind of to your point earlier, Jake, but just thinking about that kind of consolidation of power around publishing and what that ends up producing in terms of fiction. I really want more work that's not like fast, easy, relatable. I want weird, slow, maybe not so relatable. I just think just narratives where, yeah, maybe they take some time, to build, and that's okay, or they go places that we don't expect, and the character may not be somebody that you can relate to. I don't know when that became such an important thing, that we can relate to the character, to the main character. So yeah, I just think just weirder fiction. I mean, and it's out there. It's just not so much in the mainstream, and that is disappointing,
100% agree. Yeah, and that's why libraries too, I think, can be cool like sites of disruption of that, kind of narrowing, because people like Corey can refer books, and that's very hopeful, but I also think that question of relatability is a strange one too, because it's like, what does that mean? What does it mean to relate? Is that you want to be friends with that person, or you think the person is morally pure or something? I think that word is interesting because it launches a whole set of questions about what expectations readers are bringing to work. Yeah.
And it's interesting to think about that. I often, that's more of a question when it comes to protagonists that are not men. And if you're cis male protagonist, you don't have to be relatable. You just have to be interesting. And I think if you're
Lolita.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
One of the I read a lot of on writing and on publishing articles, just editors of different magazines tossing around, just talking shop and whatnot. And something I've read at several different magazines is one of the things they say, if a magazine has a number of editors, oftentimes it's not that one story that two people are like, this is the best story I've ever read, or one person liked it. It's the one that everyone can agree on the most. And I think that's kind of a strange move in fiction, because we're always searching for that one high read where you read it and you're like, oh my God, this is earth shattering. This is life changing. And it seems through certain practices like that, sometimes those things might not be getting as readily out there because they're more difficult, right? Like what Mona was saying, they might be strange, or they might not fit into the narrative that someone's looking for. And if you have a room of 12 people deciding on something, it's harder to come to the agreement between 12 than say 1 or 2 editors. And that's just a little small thing. But I think that's what one of the best things about small presses is I really like a small press called Undertow Books, and they're the ones who published Kay Chronister's book, but they published A.C. Weiss's new book. Her book won the best book cover of the year according to Electric Literature. So if you saw that, that's the one. and she does all sorts of like literary ghost stories. It's great. But they're kind of like this place where you can publish this like strange, unusual, sometimes really slow, sometimes very atmospheric fiction. And I think it'd be cool to see more of that, you know? Yeah, so we're gonna jump into this next one. Mona, if you wanna start this one, that'd be great. So the next question is, if you could give one piece of publishing advice to any up and coming writer, what would you say?
Oh God, I always come back to the same thing, that but it's from Margaret Atwood. It's just like that kind of dance like nobody's watching, you know? Because that really is, for me, that's so important, you know, just to kind of create a space in your head, you know, where you can actually be free, and just write the thing that excites you. I think it's that, and kind of staying true to that impulse, and making time and space for it, and actually making time and space for it, which can be difficult, you know. And then, you know, what Leni was saying before, which is just reading as widely as possible, and beyond fiction too, like in every genre, but then beyond that, poetry, nonfiction, just listening to people, being curious about other people. I think it's just so important. So maybe a combination of all of that. Yeah, I would say.
I would just do a +1 on everything Mona just said. And I think the countervailing force to that privacy and space to dance alone is the internet, right? It's like, it's easy to go on Twitter and be like, everyone I know is publishing books and like doing these fabulous things. And like, what am I doing? You know, the compare and despair kind of mentality. And I think that is so bad for finding the space or making the space to just, rather than thinking of what's going to happen when something's published, oh, will this person like it? You know, what do you want to write? You know, that would be my advice.
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds totally right to me. Yes, I mean, certainly you want to just write the project that is exciting to you and that moves you. And I do things sort of while you're writing that project, just try to be a good kind of like citizen of the literary community. You know, read books, promote books, be nice to other writers, support other writers. You know, I don't know about my fellow panelists, but I mean, when my book came out, you know, I found that to be one of the more challenging emotional periods of my life. And what I needed then was friends, you know, kind of like rally the people who I've developed friendships with and support groups with over the years. So but that takes work, you know, that takes work as you're writing, making sure that you're reaching out to other people and supporting other people as you're just pursuing whatever kind of obsessions and passions that you have.
Yeah, that's such good advice. That really helped me too. And I think what everyone's saying is really, really true. And I think the only thing that I would add is to not be afraid of like your specificity, you know, that to not think that won't like help with you get a community or find a publisher or find someone to respond to it. I mean, I think if you can really hone in on what it is that you want to say, like what your story is, I think like spending as much time as you can doing that is never bad.
I always want some writer just to be like, you always need to put a cat in your story. Story, it will sell and you'll be fine. Just put cats in your stories. I'm allergic to cats, so there's no cats in any of my stories. That might be a true statement if I'm really thinking about what I've written. Weird note to self. So we got one last question before we get into Q&A. I've completely forgotten who I've already asked questions of to start. So we're gonna go with Leni because I don't know if we've gotten you in the second round, but you're gonna start this one. So if you had to say like, what is the most influential book in your own life and its effect on your writing, whatever, or just something that inspired you to some like insane point where you're like, this is the book for me. What book was that and why?
I would say, can I say just one author, but multiple
Yeah.
books? I would say Virginia Woolf's work. for so many reasons, but mostly like what she's doing in her sentences, and how that is connected to the experience of interiority and consciousness, and the strangeness of everyday life. So I'm eternally grateful to her.
I always say Zadie Smith's, well, a lot of Zadie Smith's work, but in particular her campus novel on beauty, which is, I think, is the one of maybe the only book I've read like 3 or 4 times. It's just one of those books. There's like a seamless fluidity to the story that she's telling, which is actually like a very complicated story about marriage and race and class and family. And but it feels like a pleasure to read it. And that's something I always aspire to. And I think I kept returning to that again and again when I felt stuck.
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess my version of that, the book that I've read multiple times when I'm stuck, is Olive Kitteridge, Elizabeth Strout. I mean, I've talked about Florida a lot, but I'm from Maine. I'm really a Maine writer. All my stories and books are set in Maine, and so are hers. And Olive Kitteridge to me is it's that character of Olive, and the sequel is awesome too. It's just one of the fullest realist characters I've ever seen, kind of built in literature. And I'm really interested in my own work in thinking about depictions of mental health and depression. And I think Olive Kitteridge is, to me, that is such a layered and what felt to me really true portrait of what it looks like when kind of your own mind is sometimes working against your happiness. So Olive Kitteridge is that's just a book that I love and I always make my students read.
I'm reading O. William right now. Is that the sequel?
Oh, I don't know.
No, that's the different. So
okay.
she has Olive Kitteridge, that's one narrator, and then she has Lucy Barton.
Okay.
So yeah, that's part of the Lucy thread.
Got it. This is the first Elizabeth Strout I've ever read, and I really love it.
Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah.
I would probably say, I mean, I almost never say him anymore, but he was so important to me. Allen Ginsberg, how when I first heard it, it kind of just blew my mind because it was so symbolic. It was using symbolic language, but it was so confessional. And it was this honest, alive thing, but it was working on so many levels. The truth just suddenly seemed so incredibly, I don't know, textured. And I got so excited that you could actually do something like that. And that's really when I started writing very seriously, was after I heard Ginsberg read Howl, an audio recording. Yeah.
That's awesome. I always love to hear from different writers of like that one really weird spark moment where you're like, that's the thing I want to do. And I feel like that's so much of my search these days is looking for new books that do that, and I hope through this talk that maybe someone has found some new book that will do that for them, or you'll pick up one of the author's books and be like, oh, this book, this really speaks to me. This makes me want to write or to create music or to make a play or something. So hopefully that comes across here somewhere. But yeah, we've reached the end of our questions. What we do now is we do a Q&A. And like I said, the way we do it is through the chat. Feel free to throw up some questions there. That'd be great. We'll give you a minute or two. While we do that, I'm going to put up the book buying links one more time. I'll probably put them up right before we finish. But again, these are all to different indies from around the country. Authors pick them. So support the independent bookstores that are like near and dear to the authors' hearts. It's really great. And again, support your authors in any way you can, because we would like books to keep being made. So please do that. Bring on the questions, people. Or don't, it's a free country, so. But please do.
Corey, do you have a book that was that spark for you?
That's a good question. I have this kind of like weird progression, I guess, that I always cite for things like this, where like I went to undergrad and I very much was like, oh, I need to write literary fiction because like no one will think I'm cool otherwise. Um, and I had a couple teachers who really weren't into genre fiction, so I was like, oh, I'm not doing that. But then I graduated and I read Kelly Link and Gavin Grant used to edit the best fantasy and horror, or maybe best dark fantasy and horror. They did that for a stretch of time before Ellen Datlow started doing it. And I found Kelly Link through that. So I started reading Kelly Link's work. I'm like, this is amazing. Like, this is something I really want to do. But in one of those anthologies, there's a story by M. Rickert, and Mary writes, sometimes she writes as M. Rickert, sometimes it's Mary Rickert. And she's amazing. She's like the nicest person. But she writes these beautiful ghost stories that are not like any other ghost stories. She's got this one called Journey. I think it's Journey into the Kingdom. It's on Tor.com, so you can read it for free. I try to pass this around as much as possible. And it's one of those stories that starts, there's like 3 or 4 different stories in the story with different layers. And it's so good. So like I read those, I did that. And then I read some Karen Russell, and then I read Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation. And so somewhere in that stretch of things, it like kind of rewired everything in me. And I was like, this is what I've been searching for. Like this is what I wanted to do, but I've always kind of been like poking at it with my like literary stuff. And so it kind of taught me like there's a whole world open to you that I didn't get to see through undergrad of all these different genres being smushed together and being like, this is the place where you fit. So like, I think all those together were like a giant 1.5 year long spark that kind of like pulled me out of my telling myself I had to write a certain way sort of thing, if that makes sense. But thanks for asking.
Corey, do you like Brian Evanson?
Oh my God, I love.
Is that what you're describing is very like Brian Evanson also?
So the two funny things, the person who I've been published with most, like alongside, is Brian Evanson. And I'm just like, this is an insane fact. And it's because I love his work. But I also interviewed him on a podcast with, who did I do that with Eric Ragland. He does Cursed Morsels podcast. So if you want to hear an interview with Brian Evanson, you can do it there. And he is the nicest human being on the face of the earth. He's so kind and so approachable. Like, check his work out. He's the nicest person. He also contributed a story to Cape Cod Poetry Review, which I edit. So I love me some Brian Evanson, is what I'm saying. We got questions. We got a question from Derek. This one is, once it disappears, for Leni. Apologies that I haven't read it, but did you consider Roe v. Wade's overturning as a very real and short-term possibility when you started Red Clocks?
Definitely not. I started writing it in 2010, and it seemed far away and kind of like, oh my God, what like horrible thing could happen that would put pressure on all these characters in different ways. And my view has changed, obviously. I think that for a lot of us who live in America and are accustomed to the ways in which certain people's bodily autonomy and safety and lives are less valued by people in power, it can't be surprising, you know, it can just be horrifying. Right? It's hard to talk about because it's hard to convey like what's actually like how, reproductive rights is certainly not the only arena where this is playing out, but like just feeling like we're moving through a world where systematically things are getting like people's rights are getting taken away, and still I'm like, what am I going to watch on TV tonight? You know, like just like very kind of banal, like everyday questions, and that's pretty horrific as well.
It is very surreal. And if viewers out there have not read Red Clocks yet, like this is one of those examples of where speculative fiction is like ahead of the game on these sort of things. And it's always very intense when someone wrote something and then like 4 or 5 years later it starts coming true. So like definitely read Red Clocks. It was so good. And we also have the audiobook version at the library, and you can get the e-audio version through the Libby app. So like no one has any excuses why you can't read that or listen to that book. So put that on the list. We got a question from Teresa. Teresa, thank you for coming. Teresa's come to like every one of these. She's great. So thank you so much for being here. Teresa asks, how is your writing process different to everyone? How is your writing process different from first to subsequent books? Expectations on yourself, others, on you. How does it change how you approach your work?
I think I forgot that I have to write mini drafts, and I thought since I did it once, I knew how to do it again. And I definitely do not know how to. I haven't like unlocked novels, which I thought after I published one that might have been the case. But I am, currently excavating for parts, and that's hard. It's hard. So for me, like the process hasn't changed. It's more like trying to find that time, like clear the brain of all the stuff. Because as you get older and you have more responsibilities and the jobs and the things, you have just more noise. And so for the process is just a little different now in that way. But in other ways, it's like exactly as hard as it was before.
Yeah, it's a hard question. I'm trying to think about, I mean, it's certainly having my first book out was a big change for me. I guess for me, maybe one of the positives is my whole life I wanted to have a novel published. I wanted it both for myself. I also wanted to be a teacher, and I knew that would be one of the gateways to being a teacher full time. It was just this thing I wanted. And then I got my novel came out, and there were highs and lows that come along with having a novel out. And I think one of the good things coming back to my second book now is that I'm able just to really think about, like, what do I actually care about? Now that I'm kind of free from that burden of like, I have to have a book out, otherwise I haven't succeeded. Okay, I did it, I got the book out now. Like, what really matters to me? What do I really want to say? What questions do I really want to ask? So there's things about writing book number 2 that have felt immensely harder than book number 1. But in some ways, I also feel clearer of purpose than when I wrote my first one.
Well, mine was quite different. My first one was took a long time. Was kind of 6 years, really 13, if I really go back to like the very beginning, to try to write it. And then I think after all of that, the next book was a bit easier for me, actually. I took a bit of a risk because I was going into the realm of the fantastic, and my first book was more realist fiction. So I think going into the realm of the fantastic excited me because it was new terrain. It was scary, but it was new. So I just kind of had fun, and it was a very different experience. I guess I felt the same level of anxiety, but I felt a new kind of excitement because it was, like I said, it was new storytelling terrain. So that was kind of fun.
Yeah, I would probably say that's the thing I like best about working on a new book, is thinking like, okay, I'm going to do something different, not like different from anyone else out in the world, but just different from myself. Or I know I have certain tendencies or kind of like self-indulgent kind of things in my work, and I can maybe still do those, but maybe do them in a different way. And asking, kind of like Jake was saying, like asking maybe harder questions about what the work is doing. that's very vague, but that's what came to my mind. Yeah.
That's excellent. I always love hearing people's like progress and how things change. Like, I feel like so many different writers who you hear speak on this, they kind of say this, a similar thing to what Asia was saying about how like, you're always like, oh, I think I know how to do this. And then it becomes something different. And every novel becomes a different, like a different structure, a different form that you might not be used to, even though you've written the novel before. Like Jeff Vandermeer talks about it all the time, and he's got like 3 or 4 different ways he drafts and writes novels. And sometimes he does them on like post-it notes or on little flashcards or something and assembles it. And it's always wonderful hearing also like the different ways people go about this. So we got another one for Leni. This is from Hilda. I am working with your work for my PhD thesis, along with 3 other feminist dystopian works: The Handmaid's Tale, Vox, and Future Home of the Living God. Your work is among all of them. Your work out of all of them is the most hyper-realistic. I wonder how you came up with the paratopia subgenre, and how does it differ from the general feminist dystopia?
Well, first of all, I'm very honored that you're writing about my book for your dissertation. This kind of gets to the process question too, because the whole time I was writing the book, Red Clocks, like I didn't think of it as being part of any genre. Like I wasn't thinking of it as a dystopian book or anything really. I just was thinking like, how do if I have these characters and this like language I want to use, like what do I do with that? And which might sound kind of naive or so, I don't know, but the idea of like paratopia, like a sort of world that's very close to our world and like right next to it, like that idea, I didn't even consider connecting to my book until after it came out, and I was sort of talking to more people about their work, and I think one of the things, like the books you're using, Hilda, as well as, I'm thinking of like Octavia Butler and like other sort of dystopian feminist giants. Like I'm not a giant, but like Atwood and Butler, and it makes me also think about how, again, for writers of color and writers who are women, there's so much narrowing of like, oh, that's like this thing. If you write about this, then you're like in this category of like feminist dystopia, or rather than doing what's I think harder, like and maybe by writing about it, you're going to be doing this, Hilda, like asking what the differences are as well as the similarities, and ways in which books can be in conversation, even as they have really different views, or kind of views of the world, and same with writers themselves, like when Asia was saying like excavating for parts, like I totally relate to that, and also know it's like mining one's own, like the sort of detritus of like maybe what you were writing 2 years ago, which you still want, but like you don't want also, or Mona, like that the freedom you're describing of like writing in a more fabulous kind of vein, not because you're trying to define yourself as any kind of particular writer, but because like that's the book you want to write. If that makes sense. I'm rambling, so. But thank you for that question.
Sounds great to me. The next one comes in from Nana. Earlier, seeing adaptations of treasured works was brought up. I know Asia has had a work adapted, and oh, it just scrolled down on me. I know Asia has had a work adapted. Is it hard to let go creatively, or just exciting to see a new take on your creation? So I guess this goes for everyone and Asia.
I mean, in Hollywood, you don't really have a choice. So it's not like I was clinging to anything. If it's not written into the contract, you don't really have a say. The reason I went with the people that we went with to give the option for the short story to was because they were so great about their vision for it. And I was really excited to see what they would do. I didn't write that story with the intention of it becoming a movie. And so I didn't feel like I wanted to make it into a movie because I didn't know how to do that. So I would rather let people who really knew how to do that. And watching it is like, watching it is weird because it's like both mine and not mine. And so I don't watch it that much, but I think it's beautiful and cool, but it's not hard to let go creatively. I think it's just hard to experience it like independently.
What's the name of the movie and the short story?
Oh, they're both called Little Fish.
Okay.
Right, because
I
it's
think-
another work of art separate from your work of
Yes.
art, but it's also like intimately tied to your work of art.
Yeah, it's like watching a modern dance about your novel. Like what? But it's streaming on Hulu, I think, right now.
Oh, cool.
Nice. So it looks like we're reaching the end of our Q&A. Does anyone have any final questions for our authors tonight? Any questions at all? Give people like 2 seconds. I'll do the final plug for story buying links. So again, like I said, if you want to check out these links for anything, go for it. There's a lot of hardcover and paperback options available. That's one of the sad things about these digital programs is usually at the end, there's that table at the back with the piles of books and it's all like signings, it's all exciting. And you can see the cover and you're like, physical books, this is great. So pretend I'm sitting at a giant table with a bunch of stacks of books and you're like, oh my God, look at all these great covers. Just use your imaginations, everyone. Or if you can't do that, come to the library because I have all of these books. And most of them are also in, I think we have audiobooks of everyone's work, actually. Yeah, we have the audio version for everyone's books on here through the Libby app. The Libby app online, you can get tons of free and audiobooks as long as you have a library card. So definitely check those out.
I'm actually, speaking of audio, that is one other art form that I can't stand to like listen to an audiobook of my work.
Yeah,
I'm curious, like, what do you guys think? Like, to me, it's like horrifying.
I never listened to it. I think I listened to like a second. Was like, yep, that sounds good. Great.
Yeah, I listened to like the first few pages of mine and he was doing a great job, but he like mispronounced a word on page 3 and I was like, I'm out.
Done. Yeah.
I can't do it. It's not a big deal, but I can't do it.
Yeah. No, and I'm so glad they exist. I'm not like at all like dissing audiobooks. Like it's just as much reading as like anything else, but maybe it's like listening to the sound of your own voice on like recorded or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
I can see that being a thing. It's always interesting when you listen to an audio. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, I should say, like a very large amount. But it's always interesting when you get a book that's set in an area like where you live or near where you live, and you know how all the names of towns are pronounced. Like I live in Massachusetts, so all the names of towns they're oftentimes very difficult to pronounce. And if you listen to Joe Hill's audiobook for horns, which is a great audiobook, love Joe Hill stuff. It's set in Haverhill, Massachusetts. And the way Haverhill is spelled is Haverhill. So every single time he's like, at Haverhill, Massachusetts. And it makes you kind of feel like you're in The Hobbit or something, you know?
Right.
You got to go to the Haverhill. That's my weird story for you. Yeah, so there's no other questions coming in right now. So I guess this is a good, oh, no, there's one question. There we go. Another one from Hilda. This is going to be the one we go out on. I have tried writing my own work multiple times, and sometimes that blocks me every time. And something that blocks me every time is that I know what story I want to tell, but the blank page is horrifying. I wonder how you all work through that and your writing process. Solid question to finish the night. Thank you, Hilda.
There's also another question from Gabrielle.
Gabrielle, where is it?
About reading, like, did you have an option to read your own books?
You mean for audio?
Yeah.
Oh, no. I think like mostly memoirs or like Stephen King gets that option, if I'm not mistaken. Just because they want actual performers to do it,
Yeah.
which I'm grateful for because I don't want to read. You don't want to listen to my voice. And as far as the blank page, I used to not be, I used to like be really uppity about like journaling. Like, why would I want to journal? I like write for my job, like, and I regret all the uppity things I said about it because it's really helping me in this new book be less afraid of the blank page, because like journaling has so much more lower stakes. It's like just for me, it's handwritten, and it's like no one's ever going to see it. And I often find that then I'll just sort of like bleed that onto the screen. And so I just, try to find the lowest stakes version of what I'm trying to do to get over the fear.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of my ways of kind of avoiding the horror of the blank page is that I'll often start a story or a new chapter, like just like in like notes or even in like a draft of an email. And then when I'm feeling like it has a little bit of substance, I'll carry it over to a Word document. So it's just like completely trashy and messy, but it's just like text on a page and it's not white space, and that helps me. And then the other piece of advice I always give people that was given to me is just to always park on a downhill. So like when you're kind of stopping writing for the day, don't be like, okay, like I just finally finished the scene. Like I have no idea what's gonna happen next, but I'm just gonna leave for the day. Because then you pick up the next day with no idea what you're doing next. Like try to like start the next scene and then stop for the day. That way when you return tomorrow, there's like some momentum that's already happening, and you have a line that you're following. So kind of like on a day-to-day basis, you're not facing that sort of blankness.
There's an exercise I like that where if I'm imagining like a scene or a feeling or an image, I generate like at least 30 or 40 words, sensory details that are associated with it. And I just put those on the page, and then I write using and I don't know, I mean, it sounds like, I don't know why it's so simple, but like the act of just getting down phrases and words instead of having to make sentences is very helpful for me. And also it invites me like to focus less on like what's happening than how it feels, like what, how the air feels or how someone's like stomach feel, so that's a possibility.
I think I kind of do a combination of all those things. I usually start on paper. And sometimes I actually do that exercise, Leni, kind of a variation of it. Like I write words around sort of the idea. Yeah, I find that really helpful actually. And then sometimes what I'll do if I'm really, really stuck, usually I know like a scene that's in the piece. So maybe I'll start with that scene and I'll just kind of tell myself, this is not the final draft, obviously. I have to keep telling myself that. This is like the wrong thing. I'm just going to write the wrong thing and it'll be fine. And usually I end up using that. So it's just good. It's like a mental trick. You have to trick yourself into kind of confronting the page. It's like a psychological block. Yeah.
Kind of a cool piece of writing advice that Kelly Link, I've heard her talk about this before, is I believe this, I'm paraphrasing because I'm terrible at quoting things, but she was saying that like her writing process is she goes back and reads over what she wrote the day before and kind of like edits that and then begins again. And it kind of like this only works if you wrote yesterday, I guess. But it lets you get into your voice and kind of gets the ball rolling, kind of like what Jake was saying. And then you can just like dive back in. And also you have a polished thing afterwards. So it's kind of like less daunting when you're like, well, I just go over the things from yesterday and dive into it. So maybe that'll be helpful. Gabrielle also said she always loves hearing authors read their own work in audiobooks, and she hopes you all get to do it someday with a smiley face at the end, or with a heart at the end. It's interesting because they have nonfiction readers read a lot of their work. Like if you, in the audiobook world, it's oftentimes nonfiction people are doing their own thing, which is kind of cool. And it makes sense if it's like your autobiography or something. So I can get down with that. But yeah, so we have now officially reached the end of our night together. Thank you everyone for coming to hang out. Really appreciate it. And I hope you've all been inspired by tonight. Hopefully you found some new books to read. You've got some new writing advice to go take to the page. And thank you all for coming. So 2 quick things. I'm going to turn off the record real quick.